What if I told you that everything you believed when looking at portraits of ladies in lavish dresses was not true? Behind the glossy facade of the age of splendor, where every day seemed like an endless celebration, lay a reality that made your blood run cold. We are used to seeing these women as the darlings of fortune, surrounded by servants, jewels, and the attention of the most influential men in the world. But few people think about the fact that these whalebone corsets squeeze not only their waists, but also their souls, not allowing them even a breath of freedom. Their lives were scheduled down to the minute by strict protocol, where any deviation was punished by the most severe social ostracism and loneliness. They were not masters of their own destiny, but living dolls whose value was determined solely by a successful marriage and an impeccable reputation. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn the true price, expressed in broken destinies and silent tears, for the right to wear a diamond tiara in the most luxurious mansions of New York and London. I discovered this by accident while studying the plans of old Fifth Avenue mansions. And this detail struck me. The huge palaces built by American millionaires were not designed for cozy family life, but as giant stages for displaying wealth. In these houses, women were assigned the role of the main exhibit, which was supposed to shine in strictly designated settings. The hostess's personal space was often limited to her boudoir, which despite its luxury, became her only refuge in prison at the same time. Even in her own bedroom, she could not feel secluded, as the layout provided constant access for maids and valets. The walls of these rooms were covered with expensive silk and velvet, which muffled any sounds, creating an atmosphere of vacuum. The windows often faced the courtyard or were covered with heavy curtains to hide the occupant from prying eyes from the street. Here, the woman spent hours waiting for visits, changing clothes, or receiving instructions from her husband without the right to leave the house unaccompanied. The architecture of the house dictated the division of life into male and female halves, which intersected only at strictly designated times. The male part of the house included a library, a smoking room, and a study where the fates of capitals and countries were decided. She could not simply go down to the kitchen or take a walk in the garden without it becoming an event for the entire staff. Her life was constantly under the scrutiny of dozens of eyes, evaluating her every gesture and sigh. Even the keys to the doors were often kept by the steward or her husband, depriving the mistress of control over her own threshold. In these golden cages, there was no room for spontaneity, laughter, or the expression of true feelings. Luxury became a cold tombstone for a living soul who dreamed of simple human warmth. Behind the outward splendor lay a deep isolation that could not be filled by shopping or parties. It was a special kind of loneliness when you are surrounded by hundreds of people, but no one sees you as a person. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think? Can wealth compensate for the complete loss of personal space? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about what was really hidden behind the image of the perfect lady? An aristocrat's morning did not begin with the joy of a new day, but with the painful procedure of putting on the armor of her status. The corset was not just an item of underwear, but a physical instrument of control, literally shaping the body to the standards of the era. Tightening the lacing required the efforts of a maid and the patience of the mistress, who had to endure the squeezing of her ribs for the sake of a wasp waist. In this state, it was impossible to breathe deeply, move freely, or even eat normally. After the morning toilet, a marathon of changing clothes began, which could be repeated up to 6 or 7 times a day. One dress was required for breakfast, another for a carriage ride, and a third for receiving guests. Each outfit weighed several kilograms due to the abundance of fabric, underskirt, bustle, and decorative elements. The fabrics were dense, heavy, and often completely airtight, creating a greenhouse effect. Wearing such a dress required the endurance of a soldier standing guard of honor. But the physical weight of the clothing was only half the trouble compared to the burden of social rituals. A woman was not allowed to just sit idly by. Her hands always had to be busy with needlework or writing. Courtesy visits were strictly regulated. One had to know whom to visit, how long to stay, and what card to leave. A mistake in this complex dance of etiquette could cost not only her reputation, but that of her entire family. Every smile, every nod of the head was rehearsed to the point of automatism, hiding her true mood. She could not choose friends she liked. She had to socialize only with those who belonged to her husband's circle. Boring conversations with unpleasant people were part of her daily work, from which she could not resign. Even a walk in the park was not a vacation, but a demonstration of a new outfit and carriage. The inability to be herself led to tremendous internal tension that had nowhere to go. Life turned into an endless series of rituals that had no meaning other than maintaining status. In the next chapter, you will learn how mothers sold their daughters and why a title was valued more than the happiness of their own child. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the romance of past centuries? We are used to thinking of weddings of that era as beautiful ceremonies, but in reality, they were cynical business deals. At the end of the 19th century, the phenomenon of so-called dollar princesses emerged. Wealthy American heiresses who were sent to Europe. Their parents, nouveau riches, with huge fortunes, were eager to gain access to high society, which was closed to them without an aristocratic title. Impoverished European dukes and counts, in turn, desperately needed money to repair their crumbling castles. The mothers of these girls acted as cold-blooded brokers, choosing the most prestigious match for their daughters. The bride's opinion on the matter was not taken into account at all. Her feelings and attachments were ruthlessly trampled upon. Young girls, often very young and inexperienced, were literally put up for auction at balls in London and Paris. Their dowries were worth millions of dollars, which in today's money would be astronomical sums. It was the purchase of a title for cash, disguised as the sacrament of marriage. No amount of wealth could compensate for the lack of love and human warmth in these forced unions. Husbands often openly neglected their wives, spending their dowries at the races and in gambling houses. Women had no legal rights to dispose of their own funds, which were completely controlled by their spouses. She saw the fruits of her father's labor slip through the fingers of a man who did not even respect her. It was a humiliation that lasted for decades, hidden behind the facade of a prosperous aristocratic life. She had to smile at receptions, wear the family jewels, and pretend to be happy. Divorce at that time was virtually impossible and would have meant complete social ruin and disgrace. The only way out was to be humble and try to find solace in charity work or raising children if they were not taken away by nannies. These marriages were beautiful only in the pages of newspapers describing lavish celebrations and lists of gifts. In reality, they were sales transactions, where the commodity was a living human soul. Don't forget to like if you were moved by the fate of these women. Are you ready for the shocking truth that silence was considered the main female talent? In the society of the Gilded Age, there was an unspoken but ironclad rule. A woman should not have her own opinion, and if she does, she must keep it to herself. Intellectual conversation was considered the prerogative of men, and any attempt by a woman to intervene in a discussion was considered bad form. She was taught to be a pleasant backdrop, a cute creature who chattered about trifles and did not burden the male mind. The education of girls from high society was superficial. Dancing, a little French, watercolor painting, and embroidery. Any display of emotion, except for polite joy, was considered a sign of hysteria and bad manners. Crying was only allowed into a pillow, behind closed bedroom doors so that no one could see reddened eyes. Anger, irritation, fatigue. All these feelings were strictly forbidden. A woman had to be always calm, gentle, and yielding, like an angel in the flesh. This constant suppression of emotions destroyed the nervous system more effectively than any poison. She lived in a world of half-tones and hints where direct speech was considered rude. To get what she wanted, she had to resort to cunning, manipulation, and intrigue. This distorted her character and made family relationships insincere and false. Husbands and wives lived like strangers, separated by a wall of etiquette and mutual misunderstanding. Silence filled the rooms of wealthy mansions, becoming thick and suffocating. Only in the rare diaries they hid from prying eyes did these women allow themselves to be real. There on the yellowed pages, all the pain, resentment, and anger at the injustice of the world spilled out. But these diaries were often burned by the authors themselves or their relatives after their deaths so as not to disgrace the family. History remembered their dresses and portraits, but erased their thoughts and feelings. The voice of women of that era was drowned out by the noise of balls and the clinking of crystal. In the next chapter, you will learn who really ruled the roost in the house and why the mistress was afraid of her own maid. A wealthy house was never truly empty, and this became the most difficult test for the psyche. The staff of servants in the mansions of the Vanderbilts or Astors could number dozens of people, from footmen and maids to cooks and grooms. It would seem that this should have made life easier, but in reality it created an atmosphere of constant surveillance. Servants were everywhere. They brought water, lit the fireplaces, cleaned dresses, set the table, and stood behind you during dinner. They moved silently like shadows, but these shadows had eyes and ears. A personal maid knew absolutely everything about her mistress, from the details of her figure to the contents of the letters she delivered. It was impossible to hide a bad mood, tears, or secret affections from her. This closeness often bordered on dangerous dependence when the maid became the keeper of compromising information. The mistress could not simply close the door and be alone. At any moment, someone could enter to stoke the coals in the fireplace or bring fresh flowers. The concept of privacy was completely absent in such houses. The master's conversations instantly became public knowledge and spread throughout the city. Servants' gossip was the main information network of the time, capable of destroying a reputation faster than a newspaper article. A woman had to constantly keep up appearances, even in front of her own laundress or cook. She could not afford to show weakness, quarrel, or look careless. All of this was immediately discussed and condemned. She lived as if on a theater stage, where the audience was not in the hall, but right on the stage, behind the scenes and in the dressing room. She could not even pour herself a cup of tea or get dressed without violating the hierarchy and traditions. Any attempt to do something herself was perceived as eccentricity or dissatisfaction with the work of the servants. Her dependence on others was absolute and humiliating, turning an adult woman into a helpless child. She lost the ability to serve herself, becoming completely helpless without a staff of assistants. It was a golden cage where the bars were made of human bodies. Relationships with servants required constant tension and diplomacy. One could not be too friendly, lest one lose authority, but excessive strictness could provoke sabotage. This cold neutrality, which had to be maintained for years, froze the soul. The woman was surrounded by people, but there was not a single friend among them. She was a queen in her palace, but a queen under house arrest. In these houses, the walls had ears, and the mirrors had memories. Every sigh, every whisper was absorbed into the atmosphere of the mansion, becoming part of its history. And often the servants knew much more about the true state of affairs in the marriage than the spouses themselves would like to admit. What if I showed you a time machine that would take us to a Victorian-era doctor's office? Women tormented by idleness, corsets, and emotional coldness often suffered from inexplicable ailments. They had headaches, fainted, lost their appetite, suffered from insomnia, or conversely, constant drowsiness. Men and doctors of that time grouped all these symptoms under one convenient term: hysteria, or female weakness. It was believed that the female nervous system was simply incapable of withstanding even minimal stress. Instead of looking for the cause in lifestyle and mental state, medicine offered its own cruel methods of treatment. One of the most popular remedies was laudanum, an opium tincture in alcohol. This medicine was prescribed for everything: migraines, menstrual pain, bad moods, and insomnia. In fact, an entire generation of women from high society was hooked on drugs with the tacit consent of doctors. Laudanum dulled the senses and provided temporary calm, but gradually destroyed personality and health. Such treatment often led to even deeper depression and even insanity. Deprived of the opportunity to distract herself, a woman was left alone with her dark thoughts and fears. She felt punished for feeling bad, for not living up to the ideal of a cheerful wife. Doctors ignored her complaints, dismissing them as whims and imagination. Her body and mind did not belong to her. They were the subject of experiments by male medicine. Various tonics based on arsenic, strychnine, and cocaine were also widely used. These poisons, in small doses, were supposed to invigorate and make the eyes sparkle. Women drank them to meet the demands of society, to have the strength to dance at balls and smile at guests. They slowly poisoned themselves to maintain the appearance of well-being and beauty. Pallor was considered aristocratic, even if it was a sign of anemia or poisoning. Trips to the European spas were another way to escape the stifling atmosphere at home. Baden-Baden, Vichy, and Karlovy Vary were full of bored rich ladies who were treating their nerves. There they could feel a little bit of freedom, walking in the parks and socializing with other sufferers. But this was only temporary relief before returning to their gilded cage. Illness was the only legal way for a woman to attract attention and receive even a drop of care. In the next chapter, you will learn why even the birth of a child did not bring the long-awaited happiness and relief from loneliness. Motherhood in high society was not a personal happiness, but a dynastic duty. The main task of a woman after marriage was to give birth to an heir as soon as possible, preferably a boy, in order to pass on the title and fortune. Pregnancy was seen as a necessary but often unpleasant process that had to be endured for the sake of the family. As soon as the child was born, it was almost immediately taken away from the mother and handed over to wet nurses and nannies. It was considered unbecoming for an aristocrat to breastfeed or change diapers herself. That was the lot of commoners. The nursery was usually located in the farthest wing of the house or on the top floor, away from the reception rooms and the parents' bedroom. The mother could only see her child at strictly designated times, for example, before dinner, when the nanny brought him clean and dressed up. These were brief, formal encounters, devoid of the physical and emotional closeness that forms attachment. The woman became a beautiful but distant figure for her child, like a fairy from a fairy tale who appears and disappears. Nannies and governesses became the most important people in the children's lives, receiving the love that was meant for their mothers. The mother, in turn, suffered from the inability to show her feelings, constrained by the rules of etiquette and upbringing. She could not just come into the nursery, play on the carpet, or comfort a crying baby. Interfering with the work of a professional nanny was considered bad form and undermined discipline. Children grew up in an atmosphere of strictness and drill, preparing to take their place in the same cold society. Relationships between parents and children often remained cold and distant for life. Grown sons were sent to closed boarding schools, daughters to boarding houses, and the connection with home was finally severed. The mother remained alone in her huge house, having fulfilled her biological function and becoming no longer needed. She saw her children as the continuation of her family line, but not as kindred spirits. This artificial separation crippled the destinies of both generations. Women, deprived of the opportunity to realize their maternal instinct, directed their energy toward dogs, charity, or collecting. The children grew up with a huge hole in their souls, unaware of maternal affection and warmth. Wealth gave them the best toys and education, but took away the most important thing, family. And this scenario was repeated from generation to generation, like a curse of the Golden Age. Women gave birth to the heirs of the empire, but remained orphans with living children. Their wombs were sacred vessels for capital, but their hearts were denied the right to simple affection. In a world of strict rules and impeccable reputations, one mistake could cost a woman her entire life. The society of the Age of Splendor was a ruthless judge, unforgiving of the slightest deviation from the norm. Divorce in those days was unthinkable, a scandal of universal proportions, a stain that could not be washed away. If a woman decided to leave her tyrannical, alcoholic, or unfaithful husband, she was always considered guilty in the eyes of the world. She had broken her vow, she had failed to preserve the family hearth, she had brought shame upon her family. A divorced woman instantly became persona non grata. The doors of all respectable homes were slammed shut in her face. She was no longer invited to parties, and her former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting her. It was social death, which for a society lady was worse than physical death. She found herself in a vacuum, isolated from her usual circle of friends, from the news, from life itself. She had no choice but to either leave for Europe, where morals were a little more liberal, or live as a recluse. Even more terrible was the fate of those who were caught in extramarital affairs. While for a man having a mistress was considered normal and even a sign of status, for a woman it was an unforgivable sin. The double standards were monstrous. A husband could openly maintain a second family, and society turned a blind eye to it. But if a woman so much as glanced at another man, rumors began to spread that could destroy her. Rumors and gossip were weapons of mass destruction. A malicious whisper, a hint, or an anonymous letter was enough to set the mechanism of destruction in motion. Women lived in constant fear of taking a wrong step or saying the wrong thing. This fear restricted their movements, made their gaze wary, and their smiles forced. Reputation was a crystal vase that had to be carried across a minefield. They saw examples of those who had stumbled, fallen angels whose names were crossed out of guest books and family albums. These women became ghosts that were not to be spoken of aloud. Their fate served as a dire warning to the rest. Endure, be silent, and smile. Freedom was too expensive, and the price for it was complete loneliness and oblivion. The system was designed so that no bird could escape from its golden cage without broken wings. The rules of the game were written by men and for men, and women had no choice but to maneuver skillfully between them, hoping not to stumble into the abyss. It may seem that the mistress of a huge house, who organized balls for hundreds of people, wielded enormous power. But this was only a clever illusion, a facade hiding emptiness. Yes, these women oversaw preparations for grand receptions, which resembled military operations in terms of their logistical complexity. Choosing flowers, compiling menus, seating guests, booking orchestras. All this required titanic efforts and organizational talent. But the goal of this activity was one: to demonstrate the greatness and wealth of her husband. She was the top manager of the entertainment industry for one family, working without days off or a salary. The success of the ball was attributed to the generosity of the host, and the slightest failure, whether it was cold soup or an unfortunate combination of guests, became the personal fault of the hostess. She was responsible for the atmosphere, for the mood of each guest, for the sparkle of the crystal and the freshness of the roses. It was hard labor disguised as a celebration. The nervous tension before such events brought women to exhaustion. Competition between socialites was fierce and ruthless. Who would throw the most expensive ball? Whose dress would be the most fashionable? Who would have the most celebrities in their living room? This race for vanity was exhausting and draining, turning friendship into rivalry. Women spent enormous amounts of money and energy trying to outdo each other, forgetting about themselves. Their self-esteem depended entirely on the opinion of society, on newspaper articles and the society pages. The mistress's power ended where serious issues began. She could choose the color of the tablecloths, but she could not decide which college her son would attend. She could fire the butler, but she could not influence her husband's financial decisions. Her kingdom was limited to the walls of the ballroom and the living room. Outside the home, she was a powerless creature, unable to vote, own property, or sign contracts without her husband's consent. This power was a substitute for real fulfillment. Women with the minds of politicians and the acumen of business people wasted their potential on choosing sauces and sending out invitations. They built castles in the air out of gossip and etiquette, trying to find meaning in life. But when the candles went out and the last guest left, they were left alone with silence and the realization that it was all just smoke and mirrors. Their influence was ephemeral, based on beauty, youth, and their husband's money. If one of these components disappeared, the queen instantly turned into a pawn. As the lights of the Gilded Age faded and electricity replaced gas lamps, these women grew old in their huge, empty houses. Youth was fading, and with it their only recognized value, beauty. They were left alone with mirrors that no longer flattered them, and husbands who had long since lived their own lives or left this world. Children raised by nannies and sent to boarding schools became strangers, adults who rarely visited their parents' home. Old age in luxury was gilded loneliness. They wandered through halls where music once resounded, now turned into silent mausoleums of the past. Their lives, sacrificed on the altar of social conventions, now seemed empty and meaningless. Memories of balls and receptions did not warm them, but only reminded them of wasted time and unfulfilled dreams. They were living monuments to a bygone era, guardians of traditions that the new, fast-paced 20th century was mercilessly sweeping away. Many of them turned into eccentric recluses in their old age, surrounding themselves with dogs or mystics. Others threw themselves into religion, trying to beg forgiveness for sins they had not committed. Some continued to maintain their salons out of inertia, gathering around them the remnants of former grandeur, aging aristocrats and fortune hunters. But in their eyes, one could increasingly see a deep, long-standing sadness. History remembered the names of their husbands: magnates, railroad builders, bankers. The names of their wives remained only in footnotes, guest lists, and the names of charitable foundations. We know what they looked like, but we know almost nothing about what they thought, what they feared, what they dreamed about before falling asleep. Their voices have dissolved into time, leaving no echo. Looking back, we see not just luxury and glamour, but the tragedy of an entire generation of women. Women who had everything except the most important thing: the right to be themselves. They were beautiful flowers in a greenhouse, grown for sale, deprived of the right to grow as they wished. Their lives were a service to the idol of respectability, which demanded human sacrifices. Their fates are a lesson for us, a lesson that a golden cage is still a cage, even if its bars are studded with diamonds. That freedom and the ability to control one's own destiny are more valuable than any palace. And that true luxury is not silk and velvet, but the right to a voice, the right to choose, and the right to love. We have walked through the corridors of time, peeking behind the closed doors of the richest houses of the past. We have seen that behind the glitter of diamonds lay tears, and behind the lavish balls lay deep loneliness. These women lived in a world where external beauty was more important than inner freedom, and social status replaced happiness. Their stories are full of quiet drama and invisible heroism, the ability to maintain dignity in conditions of total bondage. Do you think modern women could survive in those conditions? Or have we become too accustomed to freedom? Write to us about what other hidden aspects of women's lives in history you would like to learn about in future episodes. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new journeys into the past that aren't written about in textbooks.